Hey, it works. Good morning, everybody. I got to tell you something. Clausewitz is sublime. He truly is. We read about war plans the other day, probably the most boring subject in the world, but Clausewitz takes this and turns it into an exploration of the ambiguous and dynamic nature of war. He passes on to you, his comrades, a lesson. Arm yourselves with the best ideas around, because in the end, all you're going to have is your own wits. That's, I think, genuinely sublime. I have no patience for those who say that, this is too complex, it's all simple, it's boots on the ground or magnesium or something like that. But I do have sympathy for the military professional man or woman who's looking for some harder, firmer ideas. Something about, what is it here? It's the practical art of moving armies. And yes, faced with the prospect of maintaining a force of 160,000 men over the Himalaya mountains for 10 years, that is certainly a monstrous task, and it requires some hard ideas. And for this reason, I give you Antoine-Henri Jomini, the exponent of a prescriptive and positive school of strategy and the art of war, an attempt to boil strategy down to essential principles that with a good deal of study, commanders and staffs can master. Jomini is probably the most influential military theorist of all time. He's the chief interpreter of Napoleon, more so than Clausewitz was, and it's through Jomini that we principally know Napoleon's campaigns. Jomini is also perhaps the greatest theorist who is never read. He's been banished from military academies by now. Bud Jones, Mike Gramelli, and I, we had to read it in the civilian programs, but that was when the Lakers were in Milwaukee and the Colts were in Baltimore. It's pretty much out of the curriculum. I did see that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dempsey, had put Jomini's The Art of War on his CJCS reading list. And I thought to myself, maybe it should be back in the curriculum. So I went over to Amazon to check if there's a new edition. I figured that since the chief put it up there, there's a new edition. Well, no. They're still hawking out there on the internet the old Mendel and Craighill edition, rushed to print in 1862 to help Union officers get the drop on Johnny Reb. And if you want to buy any of Jomini's works, you have to buy them in facsimile or reprint editions. But in many ways, you don't actually have to read Jomini. He's everywhere you turn. He's in service doctrine, he's in joint doctrine, he's melded into the minds of soldiers. Hell, some of the faculty here even have Jomini dreams. So what I'm going to do today is run through Jomini's ideas and those of a couple other theorists from the 19th century who, after Napoleon, sort of established what is the orthodox thinking about war, and especially war on land. And it continues to be sort of the orthodox thinking to this day. These are my main points. I got an outline here for it. Keep score in your program. So without further ado, I'm going to push on here and start talking about our man Jomini. He's a strange fellow. He had an uncommon path to the military. He was born in a middle-class household in Switzerland. He had an indifferent education, but he was good he was good at penmanship and his sums, which got him a career in banking. He was unenthusiastic about the career choice. It was the age of the French Revolution, an exciting career in soldiering, and war beckoned. But as a middle-class man and a banker to boot, he had no entree into military circles, and of course the idea of enlisting did not occur to him. So what he did was he dived into the subject of military affairs and warfare studies and started producing pamphlets to attract the attention of people in Switzerland and France. In this sense, he resembles our modern-day Beltway bandits who churn out junk to catch the eye of some general or a deputy undersecretary for something. Jomini's big opportunity came when the French invaded Switzerland, and they recognized a man of talent and offered him a position on the staff of Marshal Michel Ney, the bravest of the brave. Soon he attracted Napoleon's attention and won a place in Napoleon's own staff. His career was unhappy. He wasn't really a very good staff officer. A man of enormous ego, he clashed with his superiors, including Marshal Louis-Alexandre Berthier, the great chief of staff. And by 1813, he had completely worn out his welcome in French service, antagonized everyone, and, well, things weren't going very well for France, and so he decided to switch sides. And he took a position with the Russian forces. Similarly, he antagonized everyone there, and soon they parked him at the Tsar Nicholas General Staff Academy, just open. He became the director of education there, a position he held until his retirement. It suited his talents, but this egomaniac always complained about how the weasels were holding him back from that great opportunity to lead and become the great hero. Jomini was a prolific writer. He wrote a lot early, and he wrote often until the day he died. He was writing. His works are numerous. Four of the most important are his treatise on grand tactics, history of the campaigns of the French Revolution, the life of Napoleon, as well as the summary of the art of war. In many regards, Jomini mastered that great academic art of writing the same book over and over and over again, publishing it under a new title. But he won a great many followers and devotees for his appreciation of Napoleon, although frankly he's not just an interpreter of Napoleon. He builds on the writings of a great many other writers who came before him, especially the 18th century thinkers, the French, the Germans, in particular an Englishman, Henry Lloyd, a soldier of fortune who actually fought with the Prussians under the King of Prussia, Frederick the Great, in the 7 Years' War, and wrote in German. Lloyd was influential. He remained influential until the mid-19th century, when Americans actually needed ideas on the art of war. In 1776, they would turn to Henry Lloyd's History of the Late War in Germany for inspiration and advice. Lloyd was the most forceful exponent of an idea that there was a science of war. His approach is sort of Newtonian, and this is the age of Newton. You can discern firm laws about war, and if you can master these, you can teach it in school, and staffs and generals can become quite adept at it. Lloyd was no slouch. He was really concerned with method, the collection of data, scrupulous collection of data, and analysis. His tool of choice was battle studies. He would take a campaign or battle, look at the political objectives, and then sort of critique the military effectiveness of the campaign and see if he couldn't discern lessons from these. His work gives us sort of the first cut at what we understand as the principles of war. And he, more than anyone else, brought this into popular use, this term. He highlighted the role of objective. Commanders had to keep the political goals uppermost, not just military questions. He highlighted the use of mass. This he tied to economy of force. It's not enough just to throw mass at an opponent, but you must achieve some sort of superiority. He explored the relationship between offensive and defensive, the fact that they're not quite mutual. He's among the first to use the idea of lines of operation and lines of communication. He saw strategy as a sort of point-to-point movement, a movement from the base of the army, the starting point, to its final destination, determined by political objectives. And it's really quite a persuasive appreciation and presentation of these principles of war. Jomini borrowed heavily from Lloyd. Some might even suggest he plagiarized from them, although I think he reinterpreted them and went one better in just about every respect. His approach is similar. He's searching for the great principles of the arts. There are certain fixed ideas that you can use in most circumstances. He argued that these aren't rote. No dunderhead can use these, and they require skill, knowledge, expertise to apply them correctly, but nonetheless, they're there to be found. Jomini's approach toward the problem of war was mostly technical. Like a lot of military men before and after him, he suggested that you could roughly see where politics ended and military affairs began. He understood the political logic of war, that the civilian leadership would decide when to go to war. They would determine the nature of the operations. They would determine the resources available, the thresholds, the limits. But from that point on, it was merely a technical calculation of how to use military force. And that's how Jomini approached it. His ideas were about war in the European state system, interstate war, as opposed to, say, insurgency, religious or colonial wars. And that actually has some importance in thinking about his work. His appreciation of strategy, I think, is very interesting, and it's important to keep in mind. He starts out by saying that strategy is the art of making war upon the map. Making war upon the map. Think about that. That's very interesting. It's strategy is ultimately about moving men across space and time and sustaining those forces for sometimes very long periods. He, of course, distinguished this from tactics and operations. He suggested that strategy included the theater of war, the determination of decisive points, the determination of bases and zones of operations, objectives, and more. It strikes me that this is a fairly small or narrow definition of strategy. It corresponds most closely to our ideas about the operational art or perhaps theater strategy. Nonetheless, we can recognize in this something quite valuable and something quite familiar to our art of war. And the art of war is about moving large groups of men tied to long supply lines and distant bases. We're a long way from, Queen Boudica and her daughters smearing themselves with blue paint and going charging with the Iceni at the Romans. Jomini boiled the study of war down to some essential principles, and these I commend to you. Any military professional should know these by heart, I think. He suggested that war could be, or strategy could be boiled down to moving the mass of the army against the decisive points of a theater of operations and the communications of the enemy. You were to maneuver forces to engage fractions of the hostile army with the bulk of one's own forces on the battlefield, to throw mass upon the decisive point, and, here's the hat trick, to arrange that this occurs at the right time and with sufficient energy. It's really important not just to get to that decisive point, but to get there with fresh troops and at the right time. This general principle he extended to tactics and operations, and it infuses all of his ideas about war. Now, playing an important role in his appreciation of strategy is this idea of lines of operation. Military operations were point-to-point movements, starting at the base, aiming at the enemy's hinterland or heartland. This is something like a communications theory of war. And in Jomini's mind, the essence of strategy was to throw your forces against the enemy's supply lines while protecting your own supply lines. These lines of operation were in one sense dictated by geography. There are certain places armies can and cannot go. There are roads and highways, natural roads and byways, the rivers Meuse, Seine, Dvina, Danube, Rhine, and the like. Armies must follow these to reach their destinations, or at least they had to before the age of C-17s. These lines also were determined by the relationship between the armies as well as political objectives. They were relational in a sense. And the key is to seize the enemy's communications. Jomini's appreciation of lines extends to a sort of typology. He talks about eccentric, concentric, external lines, internal lines. Internal lines have come in for considerable attention among land commanders. These are lines adopted by one or two armies to oppose several bodies, having such a direction that the general can concentrate his whole force in a shorter period than the enemy can concentrate his forces. Napoleon's art of war relied very heavily on interior lines, and there's no better example of this than the Italian campaign of 1797. Napoleon, ensconced north of Mantua, found himself facing three opposing columns converging on his position. If these forces united, they would have enough men and materiel to crush him. Napoleon's approach was to step into the breach and use the shorter distances that he had, and he recognized his opponents had longer marches and more difficult lines of communication, and thus was able to defeat each column in turn before they could link up. You know, there's the essence of Napoleon's, fights together, march separately in a nutshell. And of course, soldiers have used internal lines ever since then with very great effect. Jomini also talked about points. And these are actual physical points, parts of a physical conformation of the land, population centers, quite distinct, I believe, from what Clausewitz was talking about. He spoke of a hub of power and movement, something big. If you could attack this one big thing, throw all your energies at it, you might get the enemy to change his decision-making calculus. On the other hand, Jomini is talking about, physical points, a crossroads, a defile, a fortress, a city. He broke these down in his way of creating typologies by speaking of strategic, decisive, and objective points. Strategic points were those that would influence the outcome of the war. They were tied to the political objectives. Strategic points might be major cities and fortresses. If you captured a particular fortress, it might be the key to this province, and you might gain control of that, and it'll affect the political outcome. Decisive points were those that would affect or have an impact on the outcome of the campaign. And these are, readily discernible. Think of the port of Antwerp. It's the largest port in the world. Was back in the 1940s. If some Americans, their Canadian, Polish, and British friends wanted to have a party in northwestern Europe and march on to Berlin for some beers, they would need the port of Antwerp to sustain themselves. The campaign hinges on capturing Antwerp. Objective points were those that were determined by the position of hostile armies themselves. And there's no better use of this concept, I think, than the orders of Ulysses S. Grant to his subordinate George Meade, laying out the goals for the campaign of 1864. He told Meade bluntly, Lee's army is your objective point. Wherever Lee goes, there you will go also. He was a man of few words, but he was quite eloquent in his way. Jomini's quite unique in the sense that not only does he talk about movements, operations, and so on, he also spoke of logistics. Most other writers, Clausewitz included, would omit logistics from their discussions. I don't really fathom this. I don't know why it is that men who think of themselves as hard-headed, practical persons, men and women, practical people, would think, would completely omit this. And they sort of believe that, you know, they're a modern-day Moses. They're going to take a staff, tap a rock, and JP4 is going to come out miraculously. Jomini, therefore, is unique in his consideration of logistics. For this unit, I went back to the chapters on logistics, and I expected to be bored to tears by talk of inventory and balance sheets. But in fact, he said something very important. It's he, not Martin van Creveld, who suggested that logistics is the practical art of moving armies. In a way, you might even think that Jomini is suggesting that, you know, strategy is an appendage of logistics. It includes everything. It includes preparation of plans and instructions for the operations, the routes of march and ingress and egress. It includes the movements to the front and the battles. It includes the supplies, the transport of these, the arrangement of camps, depots, and billets, and the like. It's a big enterprise. It defines the work of the corps, army, and central staff in a very real sense. And I have to think that much like a colleague of mine wrote in the Air Force Journal of Logistics, that old Navy man Ron Daines, he suggested that logistics is in fact a warfighting function. It's not commissary and BX stuff. And you cannot restrict expertise here to a small cadre of accountants. But all staff officers and commanders must have an appreciation of how it works and what the pitfalls are. Now, Jomini had a very long reach with his ideas. He wrote a lot. He lived a long time. Clausewitz died young. His work was never finished. Jomini kept writing until 1869. Jomini had a gift for words. He was particularly good at reaching military professionals. He understood how they thought, how they spoke. He understood their idiom. He even used drawings and diagrams to reach out to them. If he was around today, he'd be the king of PowerPoint. His ideas were forcefully presented. They're very good. Napoleon actually read some of his work and said that he was spot on, and Jomini used that endorsement very skillfully. Jomini's reach was extended by a host of others. Englishmen like E.B. Hamley, Patrick McDougall, Germans like Karl von Willesen, Americans like Dennis Hart Mahan and Henry Halleck, and Russians like Genrikh Lear, who liberally borrowed or even copied from Jomini's works to fill out their own. And in this way, Jomini's figure is really puffed up. He's sort of an imitation giant surrounded by real-life pygmies. But they were the right ideas for the right time. He arrived at a key moment. Of course, the French Revolution drove a military transformation. A key impulse here was the formalization of military education. And all of these men were associated with military education. The Prussian Military Academy was established in 1801. The French Académie de Guerre Saint-Cyr was established in 1802. The same year, the United States Military Academy at West Point was chartered. Staff colleges were soon established in England and Germany, and they were all after textbooks. And they either used Jomini's directly or they translated them into whatever language and put them into the classroom. Jomini's ideas are were fortuitous in still other ways. After Napoleon, there was an attempt to put the genie of revolution back in the bottle to undo the social, political, military changes that had occurred. The crowned heads of Europe returned to reclaim their thrones. They smashed the printing presses, disbanded the National Guards. There was a retreat to very small armies with long-term volunteer cadres. In France, the term of military service went to 7 years at this time. In Prussia, they reduced the peacetime complement to 130,000 men, disbanding the behemoth that had defeated Napoleon in 1815. There was the return of all those old retrograde ways, the discipline bordering on barbarism, treating soldiers as automatons. In Russia, this return to the old ways manifested itself in a sort of paradomania. Military life was one round of parades, and with a drill ground was manicured. And of course, there was an attempt to limit war. Gone were the sweeping objectives of the previous 2 decades, the superheated popular emotions. The emperor, Austrian Emperor Francis Joseph said it best when he suggested that, when I lose a war, I pay with a province. And in these circumstances, in the hands of military professionals of quality, and with volunteer cadres that are very skilled, Jomini's ideas work like gangbusters. And they are just perfectly suited to this era. But, it's impossible to stop change. William F. Buckley, the great conservative, he says, we're going to stand athwart history and stop the motion of the earth and the passage of time. It marches on, my friends, it marches on. Industrialization came to Europe. They came with the spinning jenny, the creation of mass production, interchangeable parts. Human power enabled the replacement of human power with hydrocarbons and steam, allowed for true mass production in this era. There was a shift to the major cities of Europe. They all grew fantastically with urbanization. There's even a demographic revolution as the population of Europe grew from 200 million to 400 million by mid-century, in just a few decades. Ripped out of the villages that for 1,000 years had given Europeans their essential identities, and now transplanted to these great industrial hells, people sought out new identities, and they found them in nationalism. And that bug was caught by just about everyone in Europe. The journalists, the lawyers, they all returned with their printing presses. And, none of the heads of Europe really, try as they might, could restrain fully the growth of mass participation in politics. And then, of course, the powers found themselves at cross purposes, angling for greater territory in the Balkans or Africa and Asia, ushering in the age of imperialism. This brought about some important changes in military affairs. It altered, in fact, the very way that countries organized themselves for war. And there was a return from about mid-century onward toward the ideas of mass national service, and conscription was adopted. The Prussians returned to it first with laws in 1834, 67, 74. They created a system in which men only served 2 years, and in this way the active duty complement could train more and more men, passing them off into the reserve so that they could have a greater body of trained manpower at the start of a war. The French quickly followed with their law of 1832 and then 68. The French were the first really to set the goal of having 1 million men available at the outbreak of hostilities. Russia and Austria, countries whose rulers were deeply afraid of their own citizens and subjects and reluctant to hand guns out to them, nonetheless found themselves having to keep up passing laws in 1868 and 74. Soon all of Europe was like the painting by Edward de Taille, an armed camp in which the rhythms of military life defined daily life. There were also a lot of innovations that came with industrialization. 3 stand out that had an effect on military affairs. They are the advent of cast steel cannon, quick-firing artillery. The Armstrong Company, of the UK put together a breech-loading gun in the 1850s, but the breech mechanism wasn't very effective. The Krupp Company of Essen, however, using a proprietary steel-making process, produced a very light field gun. Produced a very light field gun that had a rapid rate of fire and a phenomenal accuracy up to about a mile. Railways appeared, and they quickly girded the continent. In 1830, the first line opened, and very quickly there was 20,000 miles in Europe. By about 1860, France had 6,000 locomotives. Prussia had 94. Germany had 9,400 locomotives that could pull 43,000 passengers and 30,000 tons of materiel. And of course, there's also the advent of rifled, magazine-fed firearms. The Sharps Company had offered the United States government a breech loader in the 1850s, but didn't find any takers. In Germany in 1840, though, the Drese rifle was invented, called the needle gun, because it had an internal firing pin, and such a weapon could be readily produced and could reach phenomenal distances. Although the real game stopper and game changer was the Chassepot 1866 rifle. It was quickly modified to use metallic cartridges, and it had the ability to fire between 8 and 15 rounds a minute and had an accuracy of up to 1,600 yards. These things utterly changed the battlefield, and soldiers were not oblivious to this. One man in particular stands out for trying to come to grips with these changes, social, political, technological, and that's Helmut von Moltke, known as the Elder, chief of the Prussian, then the Great General Staff. From 1857 to 1888, Moltke was in many ways, he's the first modern soldier. He owed his position not to connections and aristocratic bearing or bluff and bluster, but to his intelligence and hard work. He was a remarkable man of artistic talents, went to the opera, read poetry. He spoke, read, and wrote Turkish, Russian, French, and English, Danish as well. Family came from Danish service. Moltke was he said he was a disciple of Clausewitz, and he had served at the studied at the Kriegsacademy when in fact Clausewitz was the commandant there, and read Clausewitz's magnificent book. And it's to Moltke that we owe the first real burst of enthusiasm for Clausewitz. It's to Moltke that we also owe the first fundamental misinterpretations of Clausewitz. He took Clausewitz's preachings about annihilation really at face value. And for Moltke, the complete annihilation of the enemy was a fixed value, his default setting in a sense. He also worked like no other military man to limit the influence of civil officials, civilian leaders on military affairs. He, like Jomini, believed there's a line and you ought not cross it. He did, however, have a very good appreciation of the problem of friction in war, and he's famous for saying that you have to have a flexible approach, strategy as a system of expedients. He also said that, no plan survives first contact with the enemy, and a keen mind thinking about friction. He's mostly known as an organizer, and back in the Cold War, the United States Army was deeply interested in Moltke's writings. An influential writer with TRADOC, Colonel Trevor Depew, wrote a history of the German General Staff idolizing Moltke. The idea is they wanted to bring some of that German military effectiveness to American institutions, and we get that mania for all things German here. Moltke, though, was no mere drudge. He was a strategic thinker of great significance and great breadth. He wrestled with the changes that were taking place here, the growth of armies, their new, ever-increasing size. He recognized that moving forces now represented a massive problem, and he seized upon the railways as a means of strategic communication to move forces for deployments and mobilization, but also operationally and perhaps even tactically, he hoped. Although the attachment to railways forced the army to deploy where the railways went and had a limiting effect on strategy, but he accepted this price, perhaps because he himself had invested his entire family fortune in railways and soon sat on the board of a German railway, and perhaps he's the inventor of the revolving door and conflict of interest as well. Moltke was an advocate of the new weapons. He was a proponent of the Drese rifle and insisted on bringing it into use, widespread use with the forces. He recognized that the growth in forces and the new weapons and the ranges involved had dramatically increased the size of the battlefield. It now might stretch for dozens and dozens of miles. What had been tactical evolutions to fix the enemy forces, to find the flank, could now not be accomplished on the battlefield. They might entail a march of several days and would have to be done in the full view of the enemy's raking fire. These movements, therefore, had to be transferred to the operational level, even the strategic level, and become a part of the deployment and strategic scheme. He suggested also that a new problem of command and control had arisen, trying to coordinate these vast forces and make sure that they got to the right place and the right time. That key idea was critical. He employed the telegraph. He was dead keen on its employment, and it allowed the central headquarters in Berlin a way to reach out to subordinate commanders, although Moltke recognized that perfect situational awareness and real-time communication were still eluding him. And he therefore proposed to wage war with a decentralized system. He pushed a great deal of authority onto subordinate commanders using the German tradition of Auftragstaktik, that is, mission orders. The central headquarters and commander-in-chief would set broad parameters and goals, and it would leave subordinate commanders, division, corps, army commanders to achieve these as they saw fit. The central headquarters would merely offer corrections based on reports from staff officers that were looped back to the general staff. And, he wanted a flexible system, believing, quite rightly, that war cannot be waged from the green table. Out of this emerges something like a doctrine of strategic envelopment. His is the idea that in war, the best approach would be to deploy on a broad base or a broad front and send multiple forces set them in motion along different routes of march, converging on a general center. They would use external lines to achieve a convergence. The key here was deployment and mobilization to achieve a superiority as quickly as possible and maximize that superiority. His writings are littered with the term Aufmarsch, Aufmarsch. It's all about the deployments. That's the key. And the plans only stipulated the general line of advance. Of course, armies weren't blundering around on their own blindly or aimlessly. They all had a good sense of what the task was, the Auftrag. The focus of operations was the enemy army. Find it, fix it, destroy it, work your way around the flanks, seal it off. The approach here favored envelopment, and Prussian officers favored envelopment because it offered better prospects for catching a large force and destroying it. Envelopment allows one force to use its maximum combat power while minimizing the opponent's military strength. And of course, the larger the envelopment, the better. The larger the enemy force, the larger the envelopment. And, well, what does this look like in practice? It looks something like this. Here's the campaign of 1866 in Bohemia. The broad front, the broad base, three forces set in motion, about 300,000 men, broadly converging on a point where they think the Austrian army of Feldzugmeister Ludwig von Benedek was mobilizing or lurking. Of course, it had to be here because Prague's a decisive point. The Austrians can't give that up without a fight. The aim is to find the enemy, fix them. The Second Army swings around, hooks them around Sadova or Konigratz, and the First Army then swings around trying to cut off the retreat. The result was one hell of a shellacking at Konigratz, and Václav Sohor's painting, the Battery of Death, if anything, is rather tame in its appreciation of the carnage that took place in one afternoon. 44,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured in that combat. Benedek's army was shattered. The war was over in 6 weeks. The Austrians forced to sue for peace. Moltke's achievement was widely hailed by a host of writers. He was lionized by Sigismund von Schlichting. They refined his ideas until envelopment becomes sort of a high art. And in many regards, thanks to these men, I couldn't find a picture of von Schlichting, but I think that's a pretty good image. In many ways, Moltke becomes one of the most famous soldiers of his day, far better known than Clausewitz would be, in fact. Of course, there are other ways to go at this mass on the decisive point thing. A Frenchman, Ardent Dupic, had a different approach where Moltke looked at it from the top down. The deployment, Dupic looked at it from the bottom up, the new armies, the combat soldiers that were coming into the units. And his principal work, Battle Studies, published posthumously, gives us one of the first cuts at combat motivation, and it's a very important work in military studies. Not only is it a study of combat motivation, it's sort of a critique of contemporary society. Dupic complained that the armies of old were based on stout-hearted farm boys who unquestioningly accepted the orders of their superiors. Now the army's ranks were filled by all these knock-kneed Bolsheviks from the cities who spent their time sitting on the sofa playing Xbox and eating salty snacks. These people had a fear of death, for God's sakes. And in war, in combat, he argued that it is fear that is the most important and dominant emotion. Here, he was not concerned with fear, but courage, but overcoming fear through powers of other powers, forcing the man to close with the enemy when all of his instincts tell him to throw himself on the ground. How do you put courage into men's hearts was a question that Dupic asked. You could build a new soldier, bring him into the barracks, teach him patriotic songs, make them heroes. It could also be a matter of unit cohesion and mutual confidence, he thought. Soldiers fight for their buddies. So how do you make use of that? Well, you put them into tight formations, arm in arm, shoulder to shoulder with their friends, so they don't want to show fear under the watchful eye of a mature NCO. They don't want to disappoint, and send them off bugles banging, bugles blowing, drums banging to meet the enemy. The principal concern was with offensive action. Everyone understood, as Sun Tzu did, that invincibility lies in defense, but the possibility of victory in the attack. The goal was to close with the enemy and deliver a powerful point-blank fire, as well as to close with the bayonets, and that would send the enemy scurrying away. They believed the attack was actually made more powerful by the new weapons and not hobbled as a result. Dupic is associated with an idea called the flight forward. If the instinct of soldiers in combat is to run, you might as well get them to run forward as much as run backward. The difference is the same, or so they thought. The key is to herd these men forward at the enemy. Now, these ideas seem outrageously bad to some writers, especially civilian weenies. They think that this is too simplistic. The obvious comparison is with Clausewitz, he of the deep thoughts. I don't think we should trifle with these ideas. These ideas got a long test in the 19th century. They were repeatedly used in a series of major power wars that kicked off at mid-century. These were very serious dust-ups. They include the Crimean War between Russia, England, and France, the Austro-Sardinian War over mastery in Italy, Prusso-Danish, Austro-Prussian, Franco-Prussian War. Once upon a time, the Germans were warlike and mean. And then, of course, in 1878, the Russians invaded the Balkans to liberate Bulgaria. Stranger things have happened. And these conflicts produced some very short, sharp, very furious battles. At Gravelotte-Saint-Privat on the 18th of August, 1870, a force of 188,000 Germans and Prussians met a force of 112,000 Frenchmen. They duked it out all afternoon. The butcher's bill for the Germans was 20,275 killed, wounded, captured. French losses were 12,160, I believe. And this wasn't a singular event. The day after that, there was a fight at Rezonville. Then after that, Vionville, and then Mars-le-Tour. We're shocked by these casualty counts, I think. Who wouldn't be? And we wonder what these people were thinking. Well, the going-in proposition, as expressed by one German soldier, was that great battles, as a rule, are accompanied by great loss. If you're unwilling to stake the loss here, you ought not be in the game. War is, after all, about killing. And it's not just that these produced great battles. These wars produced some pretty durable political outcomes. The fighting in August in 1870 was capped by the Battle of Sedan on the 1st of September 1870. The entire army of General Patrice McMahon, a relative of television's Ed McMahon, was captured by the Prussians and went down to defeat. In their immortal moments, the French refused to admit defeat and fought on. But in Clausewitz's phrase, the French had been disarmed. The outcome was decided. Germany would be united without say-so from any French government. It works. Now, how do I wrap this up and make myself look like a genius here? Well, let me suggest that in the aftermath of Napoleon, something like orthodox thinking emerges based on the interpretation of Napoleon's campaigns. Jomini is the key here. And his ideas about bringing mass on a decisive point at the right time with the right energy has a good deal of salience to this very day. It tends to define the art of war as we know it. People like Moltke contributed further to this. I suppose I have to admit that Napoleon and Jomini didn't invent the flank attack or the envelopment maneuver. These were known to Alexander the Great, Hannibal, Chief Little Turtle, and Sitting Bull. But it was Jomini who wrote them down so that we could consider them far from the cannon's roar and learn about this at our own pace. And, you could read Jomini and get some profit from it, but frankly, you really don't have to. You just have to open up any of our service and joint doctrine, open up AFDD1, and what do you get? The principles of a war. Universal ideas that can be applied in most circumstances with some judgment, but they are applicable nonetheless. Thank you very much, and I'll see you around.